Here we are in the Bishop+Rook shop in Minneapolis, and I wanted to walk you guys through this 200 TDI 110 project that we were working on today. Is that we pulled the body off of it, which is sitting back in the corner there, so that we could take a look at the condition of the chassis. Is that we saw some pieces that gave us a little bit of a concern, and so we're going to ultimately walk you through why this will become a chassis swap project versus just a refurbishment. Is that the economics behind changing the chassis versus doing 40 to 80 hours of welding as a workshop just doesn't make sense. So one of the things that happens with these steel chassis is that over the years people will seal them up with wax oil and gum and whatever else they want to put on here. Unfortunately, half the time that will keep and trap moisture against the body, and it'll start to rust. A lot of times these chassis will actually rust from the inside out versus the outside. So if we get to the point where we're seeing problems on the outside, that means it's twice as bad on the inside. But a couple of things that we saw just from a visual inspection underneath is, from the major parts of the chassis were great, super solid. We checked out. And even some of this stuff up here is really just dirt and mud that have collected over the years. But for the most part, it was solid. The outrigger here had been patched and, structurally pretty sound. Although probably not the best welding, which means that, you're probably going to have some issues in the future. And it also just doesn't look very pretty. A lot of times these welding jobs are just done to pass an inspection to get the truck back on the road for another year. And, if it was my project, I'd probably do the same. We run into that a lot where we're like, oh, why did they do this? And then we think about what we do to our own vehicles to keep them running, and we sort of understand. As we get back to some of these other areas back here, some of this is just surface rust and corrosion, pretty natural for a 25-year-old truck. Some of the pain in the ass is that the bolts will get stuck there. You got to cut them off. Same with some of these things here. That wasn't so much of a problem, but as we get back towards the rear, which is where a lot of the mud collects, is that we've got some swelling going on with some of these brackets, which just create bigger problems. We've got a lot of flaking here where it's, not just surface rust, but really starting to get into some major structural issues. We come around on this side, which we haven't poked at yet, is that mud and dirt and debris get stuck up underneath here. You don't see it, and then it starts to rub against the brake lines, or they come loose and vibrate and create another safety hazard. We can poke at this. If you're thinking about restoring a Defender or even buying one, is a screwdriver or a little hammer will save you thousands of heartache hours later on. This is kind of the bigger issues, is that when it starts to collect to the point where you can grab a handful of your Defender, that's sort of bad news. It can all be fixed, it can all be patched, but it's just a matter of how far do you go. When it's been sealed with the mud behind it, that means that there's always going to be some problems. We got to end up with a hole there, a bolt that's starting to return back to nature and go back to its original form, which means the next time you change your shock, you're going to have a problem there. Or what could ultimately happen is that you hit a big bump and this steel breaks loose and you run into a problem. Here's some more. I've already picked away at a big pile that was back in this corner in some of these brackets here. Just create some problems. So it's pretty normal to see patches, and it's even more normal to see kind of a rear cross member that has been replaced in the past. I'd say that 95% of the Defenders from the UK or any of the wet climates will have had this done, which is fine because these are readily available parts. It's a few hours of welding. Got to drop the fuel tank. It's kind of a pain in the ass, but it's okay. You run into some bigger problems back up underneath the rear cross member, where this one has been patched and boxed in, but it's only really hiding sort of the fact that there's no structural support there, and just some pretty lazy welding and metal cutting to get it to pass. inspection, and which means that that tow hitch is probably just going to pull the rear part of your car off if you decide to go anywhere with some weight behind it. And so the same thing was happening here. They just took some scrap metal and sort of plated over the top of it. Some crusty welds there that are just going to bust loose. And then you start to question, what did they even use for metal? Was it just something out of the scrapyard? So that was probably even a problem. And so this one, with all the different holes and bits and pieces that, we could have patched and welded and try to make new, it just wasn't worth it. And so what we're going to do is replace this with a brand new galvanized chassis, which will be treated and painted, and it will last another 25-30 years. We'll seal it to make sure that we don't have any rusting issues on the inside, and then it'll just be a nice happy vehicle. So I thought this was helpful to walk around, so that as you think about the process of either buying a Defender, adopting one, building one, a couple of things to look for that you might not be able to see from photos, and that it's always helpful to kind of dig in and get in there. And if any owner doesn't want you to do that, then they might be hiding something. That's not always the case, but if it's going to be your vehicle, make sure that it's going to be solid. So until next time, that's us at the Bishop+Rook shop, where we're going to have to figure out where to source a chassis here shortly. So thanks a lot.